It's definitely going to be a power 3 hours in Death Valley on opening weekend, but we're going to settle for Power Hour LSU, of course, courtesy Carter. You got to catch him right here on YouTube. Power Hour LSU, Power Hour SEC, and the NFL. Carter, what's going on?
Rogers, Mark, the voice of college football. It is here. They're about to put an actual football down. This has been an absolute brutal offseason as they try and destroy the sport, Mark, that we have grown to love so much. I didn't think I would ever hear the words 20-team college football playoff, but here we are. We're going to enjoy it while we still have it, and hopefully this LSU-Clemson game lives up to the billing.
With everything that we have to talk about regarding, I don't know, NCAA violations and NIL and transfer portal and 2018 college football playoffs, that's the beauty of the sport, is that once those boys are on the field and they kick off, we can suddenly be, pick your year of, you're back in the day, whatever that is for you folks. You're back in 1995, you're back in 2012, whatever year was the best for you. Hey, when they're popping pads on the field, that's when it's still college football. And we've got a really good one, obviously, with LSU and Clemson getting together for a home and home in dueling Death Valleys. And let's get caught up on this LSU football team that everybody is ranked in the top 10 in the country. So Garrett Nussmeier, much expected of him as a Heisman favorite of sorts. And he's banged up a bit with the knee issue, and now we hear Michael Van Buren's got a hand injury. So how much do you know about the quarterback health at this point?
Yeah, Van Buren will be fine, and Garrett Nussmeier will be fine. In fact, he has still looked amazing in practice, and that's not only the media version of practice, that's also behind closed doors. And the truth is, if Garrett really was hurt, since the story has been out, the guys out west would have already known, and they would have taken the number off the board. And Mark, you know that better than anyone when it comes to sports betting. So Garrett is fine. The question will be, will he be fine versus this Clemson defensive line? LSU is starting to get a little bit more solidified on their front. Brian Kelly officially announced 2 starters in their official spots. Tyree Adams at left tackle and Braylon Moore at center. He also said earlier today that transfer Josh Thompson will start at one of the guard spots. More than likely, that's going to be right guard. So left guard and right tackle still need to get sorted out before this big game versus, to me, the best defensive line LSU will play this year.
And that's with an SEC schedule. So that's a pretty bold statement. Right there. The Clemson situation on the defensive side of the ball is a bit curious to me, because when you look at the names, the individual names, and you see their NFL projections, and you know how productive they've been in college, it's a star-studded group starting with Peter Woods, and we could go right down the line. However, 85th in rush defense last year against a fairly weak schedule. We know LSU had a little semblance of a running game and really hasn't had that star-studded running attack in recent years. So can this LSU running game 2025 maybe take advantage of what has been a porous Clemson rush defense?
Yeah, and that's a weird thing about this matchup, Mark, is when you look at last year and you looked at LSU's offensive line, you would have thought that they would have been one of the better rushing attacks in all of college football for their 5 starters getting drafted. And, well, they were not that. It was a very clunky run game. And the opposite is also true. When you look at Clemson's defensive front, Mark, you thought that would have been one of the most ferocious run-stopping units. We all remember Dexter Lawrence of yesteryear, and it's not been that. So that is really strange. The only problem for LSU is that they are replacing pretty much their entire offensive line, and Clemson is returning most of their defensive line. And with Clemson being at home, it's going to be very difficult to run the football. The issue, though, from Clemson's vantage point, and this is a big positive for LSU, is Caden Durham is the real deal. I think he's probably nationally the most underrated player on this LSU team. I really do think he has first team all SEC potential. He's pretty much been on everybody's second or third team. He's big time. You look at some of the sports books, they have him as the odds on favorite to be the leading rusher in the SEC. And that's impressive considering Garrett Nussmeier likes to actually throw the football most of the time. So, for me, I think Caden Durham is going to be a tough matchup for this Clemson front. And I think he's actually going to have a good day.
Got Carter here breaking down the LSU Tigers. Of course, they've got a huge one on opening weekend against Clemson on the road, and opening weekend has not been kind, of course, to Brian Kelly. This wide receiver core, when you look at Chris Hilton, Aaron Anderson, they picked up Nick Anderson from Oklahoma as well, and Xavier Thomas. Where does the potential of this wide receiver unit stack up against some of the great LSU units of the last 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I would have them outside the top 5 in terms of like preseason ranges of outcomes or projections, if you will. But they're in that next tier, which is actually a really good thing considering how many great LSU wide receivers have actually run through the university. So, for me, Chris Hilton is obviously going to be the deep threat of this offense. Aaron Anderson returns as an over 800-yard receiver coming back from last year. He'll be more of your pure slot option. Obviously, LSU has 2 really good receiving tight ends with another Oklahoma transfer in Bauer Sharp and Trades Green, who many feel has the most upside out of any of the pass catchers. But what's interesting, Mark, let's talk about the one wide receiver that you didn't mention in that hodgepodge of names, and that is Barian Brown coming over from Kentucky. Of all these receivers, there's only one on this team that had a career day versus Clemson, and that's what he did his sophomore year at Kentucky in a bowl game. Had a kick return for a touchdown, had a few other great plays in that game as well. So Barian Brown actually has been a guy that's made plays all throughout camp for LSU. So you see this Clemson front, their front and linebackers is what everyone knows him for. But that secondary for Clemson is good too. Terrell is a very nice player, but they are on the smaller side, and LSU has a few towering big weapons on the outside. So I could see Garrett Nussmeier having a big game in this spot.
Carter's here to break down some LSU football for us. It's always a good time when we are able to track him down, but you can get the full effect if you if you catch up with Carter, of course, here at on YouTube at Power Hour LSU, and you see the whole lineup there. Power Hour SEC, Power Hour NFL. There it is. Well, the defense has been retooled with some impressive names coming to the transfer portal. The big question is, how do they mesh, and how quickly do they mesh, and what's the latest position of one Harold Perkins, and will that be to his liking?
I'm excited for Harold Perkins because Mark, he's dominated camp. He missed a day of practice this week, but they do feel pretty good about him. It wasn't an injury-related absence. So, man, I will be honest. I have been blown away with what I've heard from actual media that's boots on the ground at every practice or at the practices that they're able to go to, and just players that I speak to. They're like, Harold Perkins looks like old Harold Perkins. And I think part of the reason why, Mark, you're seeing him have this resurgence is because of clarity, right? Ambiguity is a difficult thing to deal with as a player, and that's always been the difficulty with Harold Perkins, trying to figure out what his best role is. So this is what Blake Baker decided to do, the defensive coordinator of LSU. He went to Harold Perkins and said, hey, what do you think is best for you? And Harold Perkins said star. So star is obviously the nickel in this defense, and obviously he's not a defensive back, but that is essentially what you're doing, right? You are a linebacker, hybrid safety, whatever. And the thing is, what I think Clemson will do offensively is try to stretch him out, try to get him in spots where he is lined up over one of those really good receivers for Clemson, whether that be Wesco, Williams, or more. And that's going to be the cat and mouse game. Here's the thing, though, Mark, is LSU will be better served with Harold Perkins in this role because their corners are going to play better. And if their corners can play better, that means you can have a safety come match up versus a slot wide receiver, and you can just play single high instead of two high. So I really do think Harold Perkins is in a better spot? Because I'll be honest, Mark, you can ask any of my audience. I was skeptical in how he could fit coming off this injury. So we'll see. Hopefully he'll be ready to go week one, rehabbing from the serious injury he had this past year. But based on what I'm hearing, everything is looking fine right now.
Wood Weeks obviously plays with his hair on fire, racked up a ton of tackles, 135 last year. We're excited to see AJ Halsey as one of the star pickups via Houston. Who are the guys that you're excited to see on the defensive side? And what is the ceiling, a reasonable ceiling for this defense? Do we get back to any kind of LSU standard on that side of the ball?
Yeah, I think this will be a good defense. And going into last year, anyone can go listen to the streams that I did. I'm not just sunshine and rainbows, even though I had this LSU mural behind me here. The truth is, Mark, I felt that the defensive personnel was lacking. That shouldn't be the case this year with what they did in the transfer portal. And the guy that has really torn up practice, even more so than Harold Perkins, even more so than Jack Pyburn, who's at a good camp, is a guy by the name of Bernard Gooden, the South Florida transfer who is an undersized 3-technique defensive tackle. They feel comfortable, even though he's not the biggest guy, to go in and just cause havoc, because that is essentially what he has done since he has been available as a transfer in practice. So Bernard Gooden, number 88, a little bit of an obscure defensive tackle jersey number. He can play. I mean, he's got real juice firing off the football. So that is the guy you have to keep an eye out for.
We are just over a week away from the Battle of Death Valleys, LSU and Clemson. And, of course, everybody starts the season 0-0. But considering this LSU bugaboo in season openers and the expectations of competing for an SEC, if not a national championship, is there an undue amount of pressure on Brian Kelly and this team? Because even though they've got no record like everybody else, it's almost like if they're listening to the media pundits, like they're carrying this 4 or 5 game losing streak into this game with them. And there's like this added pressure that they have to show that they can compete on a national stage right out of the gate.
Yeah. So they have done a better job of just focusing in on this Clemson game, all the way down to the messaging in their building, right? Everyone on this team knows it. Even though Brian Kelly is safe for 2026 in large part because of the buyout, he is under as much, if not more, pressure than any other coach in the SEC. I feel a guy like Venables, his seat is hotter, Freeze, his seat is hotter, but the pressure on Brian Kelly is about the same. And I know that doesn't sound right, because if you feel your job is safe, why do you feel as much pressure as guys whose job might not be as safe? Well, a lot of it is because of Brian Kelly's comments, Mark. He has said, hey, judge me by year 3. Well, we're year 4, going into year 4, and there's no playoff appearances. So this is the year for LSU. And you get year 2, Garrett Nussmeier. I know you lost Will Campbell, Emory Jones, and some other nice pieces, but I mean, he's got to deliver. I mean, he's really got to deliver a playoff appearance. And the one thing I would also say, Mark, as far as the season opening thing is concerned, Clemson has also lost 3 of their last 4 season openers, where they have put up a combined 13 points in those losses. So, there's questions to be had about Clemson in this spot as well, even though they are at home and even though they are a 4.5-point favorite.
And just to add to your number, of course, Clemson took an 0 for 3 against the SEC last year, South Carolina,
Crazy.
Georgia, and Texas, and they've not fared well. I actually counted that back to 2020 from the time Trevor Lawrence Carter walked off campus. Clemson is 3-7 against the SEC.
Wow. Yeah, I knew the 0 for the last 3. I didn't know the 3 for the last 7. And one thing that's very interesting, Mark, is I look at Clemson, and once I dove a little bit deeper, because I'm going to say something that you shouldn't say as an LSU YouTuber, is I'm actually picking Clemson to win this game, right? I think they win this game 6 out of every 10 times. So I'll lean that way, even though I am high on LSU going into the season. What I would say, though, is you look at what Clemson played last year, it was one of the weaker schedules of the teams that actually did make the playoff. So I'm interested to see what this team does, not only versus LSU, but moving forward. But, I'll be honest, I feel as if I have overhyped Clemson after watching them as much as I've watched them over the past week, but I am still leaning in their direction and picking them to win this game versus my beloved LSU Tigers. And here's what's funny, Mark.
Yeah.
Everyone has been saying that's a good thing that you're picking us because that means LSU's actually going to win.
Well, this is where I wrestle with Clemson, and we kind of alluded to it, is I love their pass game. The three guys at wide receiver are phenomenal. If you watched the Texas playoff game, they had no business being in that game and kind of hung in there until about 4 or 5 minutes left, just basically because Cade Klubnik can play and they got three wide receivers. The rest of the team was dominated. And then we talked about the defensive struggles last year, despite the NFL presence there. And this team, up until that SMU game, which was just a last-second miracle 59-yard field goal, the best team they beat last year was a 7-6, a rough 7-6 Pitt team. Like LSU, from a lot of perspectives, had a better season and played better against better opponents last season than Clemson did. And there's just all this Clemson love, and all I'm seeing is Clemson, Penn State, or Texas are basically, those are the only three teams anybody can choose from to win a national championship.
Yeah, and it's funny, like I am in on the Clemson hype because they were so young and they do return so much production, and they do have an absolutely positively massive defensive upgrade going to Tom Allen, who I think was phenomenal last year with Penn State. I know he had Abdul Carter, but I mean, he was still fantastic what the Nittany Lions did. But I'm with you, Mark. As I started picking apart, what they did last year, I don't think that Louisville team was a world beater. They come into your house and they beat you by 2 scores. Yeah, there was some hokey dokey stuff in that game, but whatever. And then even in the SMU game, I know that they blew a pretty large lead, but man, they had a lot of breaks to get to that lead. There was a roughing the passer call that was very questionable that gave Clemson an early touchdown. And there were so many things from that game that was just weird. But, here's the funny thing, Mark, is, you look at this from an NFL perspective, it's going to draw a lot of eyeballs with Garrett Nussmeier going up against Cade Klubnik. There will be quite a few Indianapolis Colts, New Orleans Saints fans might be scouting out their next QB. So I'm excited about that as well.
And a big season forecasted for both teams, but especially Clemson. And one of the big reasons why is, of course, Cade Klubnik, who's become arguably the best quarterback in college football.
Yeah, he is. And, the guy I think you would argue with the opposing guy would be Garrett Nussmeier. So this is the matchup of probably the top 2 returning quarterbacks in all of college football. Nussmeier threw for 4,000 yards. LSU didn't have much of a run game, so they leaned on him a ton. For Clemson, they had a decent run game early in the year, but it sort of faded as guys got hurt. Phil Maffa was playing banged up, and by the postseason, he was pretty much completely out. Against Texas, they really had no running game. They moved Adam Randall with 3 days of practice at running back. They moved him to running back. They basically aired it out, and Texas still couldn't stop him. Now, Klubnik's back. His top 3 receivers are back. Tyler Brown, who was the top receiver not last year, but the year before, he's back and healthy. So this is going to be the best wide receiver core they've had since, 2019. Best quarterback they've had since Trevor Lawrence of 2020. Defense should be better. I think the big bet is just how much better is that defense going to be. It wasn't good at all last year, but there's tons of talent coming back.
Yeah, the wide receivers, along with Cade Klubnik, I go back to that Texas playoff game, which from most standpoints, Texas dominated. However, it was a 1-score game with 4 or 5 minutes left. Clemson still had a chance, and it was Klubnik, and it was those 3 wide receivers. And Clemson, for really owning the position in college football for a decade, really had a slump at wide receiver for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And now it seems like they've taken hold at that position once again.
Yeah, I mean, Clemson fans wanted to crucify wide receiver coach Tyler Grisham. They were mad, and it was kind of during that spell where Sweeney was hiring a lot of guys who didn't have outside experience. So you sort of don't blame the fan base for it. But Clemson's receivers were mediocre to bad pretty much from the time Trevor Lawrence left. You really wonder what would have happened to DJ Uiagalelei in his career had he had some good wide receivers. Joe Ngata was a big-time prospect, and he just, he wasn't great at A, staying healthy, and B, having the burst and the speed to get open. Frank Ladson was a guy that I was always high on out of Miami. He was a big-time prospect, and he was really fast, but he dropped the ball, and he got hurt a lot. Justin Ross was a big prospect who was incredible as a freshman, and then he started to have injuries and drops, and the wide receiver core really tailed off. But more recently, really just last year, freshman TJ Moore, who you mentioned, freshman Bryant Wesco, really changed everything. Those two guys were outstanding, and it wasn't just Antonio Williams anymore. So that trio might be the best in the country. I mean, Ohio State's always dominant at wide receiver. Auburn's really good this year. Alabama, Ryan Williams, but easily a top 4. I think you can argue the best wide receiver core in the entire country. And it's only in the past, decade. It used to be that wide receiver, I don't feel like was as critical of a position as it is in today's game, but it's nearly as important, at least as a wide receiver core and almost as a quarterback. I mean, it just completely changes the game. So for Clemson to have that advantage is tremendous.
Well, Ryan, we know what's important up front is keeping the other team off of your quarterback and your running back and wide receivers and allowing them space and time to maneuver and execute plays. And this is a place where Clemson has not necessarily been dominant, but it looks like they may have one of their better offensive lines in a long time. And then kind of merge that with the running back position, because I think if there's a spot on the field where Clemson has a lot of uncertainty and is pretty thin, it's at running back.
So I'm not as concerned about running back as sort of the talking heads are. And it's absolutely true. Clemson does not have a clear, experienced running back that you feel comfortable with, but they have enough options. I think the odds of none of them working out are pretty slim. I mentioned Adam Randall. He has very, very little experience, basically 1 game of experience at running back. So totally understand the doubts there. But as a wide receiver, he wasn't good at getting open. That was his critical flaw. Everything else, he was pretty good, right? Like once he had the ball, he could move. He had the agility, he had the strength, he had the speed. He just wasn't good without the ball. So you basically hand him the ball, don't make him run routes. That's a lot better. But, let's say he doesn't work out. He's had injuries. Maybe he gets hurt. Who knows? You also have freshman Gideon Davidson, a big-time high 4-star out of Virginia that is getting rave reviews in camp. But, hey, he's just a freshman, so maybe he doesn't work out. Well, look, there's more guys. David Iziomume, a redshirt freshman out of Cobb County over by me in Georgia. He was another big recruit, and he was awesome in the spring game. Juked Ronan Hannafin, a guy folks are really high on. Juked him out of his shoes, ran by for a long, 25, 30-yard touchdown. He looked great. Power runs and speed runs from him, from EZ. So there's 3 guys right there. And then Jay Haynes, he's coming off a torn ACL. I don't think he'll make an impact the first quarter, maybe in the first half of the year. But he's a 4th guy. And then maybe lower ceiling, but just depth. You still have Keith Adams Jr., who's a veteran, kind of hammerhead power back. So will there be – do we know which one's going to work out? Absolutely not. But are all 5 of them going to be busts? I doubt it, right? I think 1 or 2 or 3 are perfectly sufficient. And then, like you said, Matt Luke has transformed this offensive line. I don't know that they're super elite yet. I think that takes a long time with an offensive line. So maybe they're not Notre Dame or Penn State, but they're not what they were 2-3 years ago. I think they're a far above average offensive line. They returned 4 starters. Questions at left guard where Marcus Tate, who's kind of underrated, he leaves. Not sure who's going to start there. Maybe it's Harris Sewell. Maybe it's Colin Sadler. They could be decent. The other guard, Walker Parks, he's a 6th-year senior now. He was awesome his first 2 years when he was a right tackle. Has never really been great at right guard. A lot of that's injury. We'll see. If he can excel, this offensive line could be awesome. But if not, I think they'll still be decent enough. But, yeah, this is going to be a team with an elite passing game. 4-year, a true actual senior at quarterback, elite wide receivers. The running game just needs to be decent, and I think it should be.
Ryan Cantor breaks down Clemson football on a regular basis. Join him right here on YouTube. It's easy to find. You see his name right there. Ryan's joined us here at the Voice of College Football for years and years and years, going back a long, long ways. You know, Ryan, of course, the Clemson defense, vintage along the defensive front in their heyday. I'm looking at the names coming back, and they're so incredibly impressive. Wade Wood, Sammy Brown, Peter Woods, of course, a complete freak, TJ Parker, all these guys that are names in college football, veteran presidents, guys that have future NFL careers, all of that. You would think that they would have been better last year. They were 85th against the run. So I'm trying to make sense out of Clemson not being Clemson on defense last year, bringing back all these guys, but expected to turn a corner.
Agree. This is the real question mark that people should be asking. So you bring in a defensive end through the transfer portal and Will Held. They also brought in Jeremiah Alexander, a linebacker. But the key piece there is you bring in defensive end. Before last season, I think anyone who, was following this team pretty closely and had any level of objectivity said they desperately need a defensive end. And evidently, Coach Sweeney asked the defensive end coach, Coach Rumpf, you want to go in the portal and get one. They had just lost a guy they were going to redshirt, a freshman, Adam Kisai, just lost him to transfer to Minnesota. The spot was available, and he passed up on it. And in hindsight, but really even at the time, it was kind of like, this is madness. This hole is so gaping. And then it just plagued them all year. Second half of the Georgia game, they got crushed on the outside. Against Stanford, crushed on the outside. Against the Citadel, crushed on the outside. And then finally against Texas, just killed them on the outside runs. So, look, they bring in Will Held. Is that really going to make him from 85th to not just average but good? Now, I don't think anyone's saying that's the difference, right? You have that. You also have new defensive coordinator Tom Allen coming over from Penn State. So, if you think they're going to go from 85th to 3rd, you're really saying Wes Goodwin was really, really not doing great. And so how much can you really improve him? Do I think Tom Allen is fantastic? I absolutely do. I think he's a top 2 or 3 defensive coordinator in the country, possibly. How much of that struggle was they needed a defensive end that had a massive hole there, and how much of it was the coaching? If most of it was, this is a national championship contender, could even win it. If there's other issues, other players that, we're just maybe overrating, that's not going to be the case. Peter Woods was playing out of position. So you put Will Held at that defensive end, the better defensive end. You put Peter Woods defensive tackle, they're much better defensive tackle. So there is some trickle up sort of thing there. But that's the question. How much do they improve with most of the guys coming back? Same guys who were part of that mediocre defense last year. So that's the biggest question mark for me.
Yeah. So if we take what we just broke down in regards to me leading in with a question that you kind of confirmed in regards to all this talent back, veterans, productive players in college will play in the NFL, almost all of them, but the numbers aren't there. The performance isn't there. Then take that to the entire team. And we've got an entire team that everyone has in the top 3 in the nation. There's basically only 3 teams that I continue to hear as national championship selections, and it's Texas, Penn State, Clemson, over and over and over and over. And then I look at what happened last season with largely the same team and think they weren't close to Georgia. They weren't very close to Texas. They lost to South Carolina, should have won the game, but still South Carolina, not a great team, a good team. The best team that this Clemson team beat last year in the regular season was Pitt. They went 7-6. So I'm trying to wrap my head around. I can see why people are high on Clemson, but at the same time, why are they going to break through and start to beat elite teams?
This is the perfect question that I feel like no one's asking. I have a video that's going to drop later this week. Let me give you a little kind of mini version of it. So you're kind of implying this, and I'm going to say it. They were paper tigers last year. They were not that good. Pitt, Virginia, who did they beat, right? SMU's, they're really the only good win they had all year is really it. They got beat kind of bad in a home night game to Louisville, who turned around and lost to Stanford. This team was not that good. At the end of the year, maybe the first half against SMU and pretty much the whole game against Texas, you started to see it. But you're banking on three things changing in a big way. A lot more experience. Basically, everyone comes back, so you're betting on all those guys getting better. And I think that's very viable, right? You had Bryant Wesco, maybe your best wide receiver. Or second best wide receiver, I should say. He's a freshman. Now he's a sophomore. TJ Moore, now he's a sophomore. Tyler Brown, now he's a redshirt sophomore. He's healthy. Antonio Williams, senior year. A lot of that kind of story on the offensive line, same deal. So you're betting on progression. So that's I think pretty reasonable. Your biggest bet is on coaching, right? You're going to get Ben Boulware and those linebackers. He's coming in. He's going to be focused on the linebackers. He's going to bring that energy. As much as I complained about Coach Sweeney getting guys who played for him or played with him, Boulware is that, but he brings a fire and credibility that is kind of the opposite of that kind of laid back, chill defense. They're going to blitz. They're going to be fire in practice. So I think that attitude change. Tom Allen has kind of that same attitude. And then Tom Allen also bringing the schematics, the strategy, the accountability. And so that's where, like I said, I wonder, is it that much better? How bad was the coaching? How much better is the coaching? But I did hear one thing that, kind of caught my attention. It was TJ Moore was on the mic doing, answering questions. And he said there's just so much more accountability, which seems like, that should never be a thing, that there's not enough accountability. But I think back a couple of years, and I remember after Clemson lost to Duke, Barrett Carter saying, I wish I had been in better shape. I really wasn't in playing shape in hindsight, which is completely unacceptable and kind of on the coaching to some extent. And so I think you're seeing that flip on its head. So I believe in the coaching getting a lot better. And then the third thing is they use the portal. I've been begging them to use the portal. I've heard a lot of people say Dab was winning his way. Maybe to some extent, but he's basically doing everything that the fans have been begging. Bring in good, experienced outside coaches. Bring in a few pieces from the portal to change everything. I think that's what Will Helt is. I think Jeremiah Alexander at linebacker kind of assures they're deep there. I think Tristan Smith at wide receiver gives them, I think he maybe gives them the best wide receiver core in the country by giving them, 5 guys who are excellent. So they sort of did 3 things that really should skyrocket them. But yeah, I agree with your premise. They weren't really that good last year. They were the worst team in the playoff. They didn't really they weren't one of the 12 best teams last year, but I think they can go from being the 16th, whatever it was, 15th best team to being the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th best team. I think that's super viable. So I'm admitting you're right. I'm admitting all those criticisms are totally legitimate, and I'm still that high on Clemson.
And Ryan, of course, this game could come down to a kick. So what does that look like?
Well, Nolan Hoozer's a great kicker if they'll just block for him. I hear that former Clemson basketball player Ian Shefflin is getting a lot of his work on special teams and field goal protection. So it'll be funny if Will Helt and Ian Shefflin are the guys out on special teams, ensuring that the special teams unit avoids those block kicks that they struggled with last year. But Nolan Hoozer's a great kicker, so that'll be. I won't be overly worried about him making them as long as he can get them, 10 feet across the line of scrimmage.
Yes, I did post my Clemson prediction video, and I've got my notes in front of me, and I had forgotten about his I did not forget about it, but his last-second kick against SMU, and did not recall whether he was back or not. So
yeah,
they're in good
he was
shape
only
there.
freshman last year. Yeah, he'll be a special kicker at Clemson. As long as we can not let all of his kicks get blocked, they're usually going in.
Well, Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by, breaking down Clemson, because this will be a fun one to watch, that's for sure, against LSU.
Oh, yeah. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.